Some memories don't disappear because they are forgotten. They disappear because the heart is waiting for the one voice strong enough to bring them home. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., the staff at Willow Creek Veterans Memory Center watched the same heartbreaking ritual unfold. An elderly man with silver hair sat beside the same rain-speckled window, his hands resting quietly on the arms of an old wooden chair, as if he were waiting for someone who had been running late for decades. His name was Walter Hayes, 87 years old, a decorated veteran whose medical chart described him with only a handful of clinical words. Advanced dementia, severe memory loss, minimal recognition of family members, poor verbal communication. Those words sounded simple enough on paper, but they failed to explain the sadness that lingered in room 214 every single day. Walter no longer recognized his daughter. He didn't remember the grandson who visited every Sunday carrying baseball cards and stories from school. Most mornings he didn't even remember his own reflection staring back from the bathroom mirror. Doctors had tried medications. Specialists had tried cognitive therapy. Music therapists had cycled through hundreds of familiar songs from the 1940s and 1950s. Nothing lasted more than a few seconds before the fog settled back over his mind. Before we continue this remarkable story, thank you for supporting our channel and spending your time with us. Your encouragement means more than you know. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, kindness, and unexpected moments that change lives forever, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so we can continue sharing many more unforgettable journeys together. Then Walter would return to staring through the glass, silently watching birds land on the oak tree outside, as though they carried messages no one else could hear. The nurses rotated through his room every shift, carefully following routines that had become almost ceremonial. Introduce yourself. Speak slowly. Offer breakfast. Encourage hydration. Smile even if there was no response. Most of them cared deeply, but after months of hearing the same empty silence, they eventually accepted that Mr. Hayes simply lived in a world beyond their reach. All except one. Grace Miller had worked at Willow Creek for just under 6 months. She was 32 years old, soft-spoken, patient, and remarkably difficult to fluster. She never rushed her patients, never raised her voice, and somehow managed to remember every resident's favorite drink, preferred blanket, and birthday without consulting a chart. Her navy blue scrubs were always neat despite the long shifts, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that kindness rarely needed an audience. Some of the senior staff appreciated her dedication. Others quietly dismissed it as inexperience disguised as optimism. Dr. Lauren Whitmore, the facility's respected neurologist, had made her opinion perfectly clear during morning rounds. "Grace," she said while reviewing Walter's chart without looking up, "you're spending far too much time in room 214. Mr. Hayes isn't going to remember your face tomorrow, your name next week, or anything you say this afternoon. You can't build a bridge where the river no longer exists." Several staff members exchanged knowing smiles. One orderly shrugged sympathetically. Another nurse gently suggested that Grace might accomplish more by focusing on patients who could actually respond. Grace simply nodded. "Everyone deserves someone who keeps showing up," she answered quietly. Dr. Whitmore offered a polite but skeptical smile before moving on to the next patient. As the hallway grew busy with rolling medication carts and quiet conversations, Grace walked back toward room 214 carrying a warm cup of oatmeal, a small pitcher of orange juice, and the same calm expression she wore every morning. Walter never looked up when she entered. He remained focused on the window, watching leaves drift across the courtyard. Grace placed the breakfast tray beside him without saying a word. She had already learned something the others hadn't. Sometimes silence was the most respectful way to begin a conversation. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and steady rain tapping softly against the windows of Willow Creek Veterans Memory Center. Most residents gathered in the dining hall for breakfast, exchanging fragments of conversation that drifted through the room like familiar melodies. Walter Hayes remained by his window as always, his untouched oatmeal cooling on the tray beside him while his distant eyes followed invisible paths across the courtyard. Grace Miller quietly pulled up a chair several feet away instead of standing over him. She had learned that sitting beside him felt less like giving instructions and more like sharing the morning. She opened the blinds a little farther, allowing warm daylight to spill across the room. "Looks like the birds came early today," she said gently. Walter did not answer. His expression remained calm, almost peaceful, yet impossibly far away. Grace simply smiled and poured a small glass of orange juice, placing it within easy reach before taking out her notebook to complete routine observations. Across the hallway, Dr. Lauren Whitmore watched from the nurse's station before shaking her head. "She is doing it again," she said to another physician. "Every day she spends nearly 30 minutes with one patient who cannot even recognize her. Compassion is admirable, but time is a resource." Several nurses exchanged quiet glances. One of the newer staff members whispered, "She really believes he will remember someday." Another responded with a sympathetic smile. "Some people need experience before they accept reality." Their comments were never cruel enough to become formal criticism, but they carried the subtle weight of dismissal. Grace heard enough to understand exactly what they thought. She chose not to defend herself. Instead, she continued folding Walter's blanket neatly across his lap, before checking that his sweater sleeves were comfortable around his wrists. When lunchtime arrived, Walter still had not spoken a single word. His daughter Rebecca Hayes arrived shortly after noon carrying a small box of homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped in blue ribbon. She visited every Wednesday without fail, even though each visit ended the same way. She knelt beside her father, smiled through hopeful eyes and softly said, "Hi, Dad. It is Rebecca." Walter looked at her politely, almost as though she were a kind stranger passing through the room. There was no recognition, no smile, no sign that he remembered the little girl he had once taught to ride a bicycle along quiet suburban streets. Rebecca swallowed the disappointment she had practiced hiding for years. Grace quietly offered her a cup of coffee, and the two women stood near the doorway while Walter continued gazing toward the rain outside. "Does he ever seem different with you?" Rebecca asked softly. Grace hesitated before answering honestly. "Not different in ways most people would notice. But sometimes I think he listens more carefully than he lets us believe." Rebecca smiled sadly. "I hope you are right. Everyone else tells me to prepare for the fact that he is already gone." Grace looked back toward Walter, who slowly lifted his eyes toward a pair of robins hopping across the wet grass. "I do not think people disappear that easily," she said. Neither woman noticed that Walter's fingers had begun tapping almost imperceptibly against the wooden armrest. The rhythm was faint, uneven, and lasted only a few seconds before stopping completely. No monitor beeped. No dramatic change appeared. Yet somewhere beneath decades of fading memories, something had stirred for the very first time. Friday afternoon brought a welcome change to the usually quiet memory care wing. Families filled the hallways carrying flowers, homemade desserts, and old photo albums, hoping that familiar faces might awaken familiar memories. Volunteers decorated the recreation room with small American flags and framed photographs from different decades of military service, preparing for the center's monthly Veterans Appreciation Gathering. Residents who rarely left their rooms were gently wheeled into the bright common area where soft conversations blended with the sound of coffee being poured and chairs being arranged in neat rows. Walter Hayes remained one of the last residents to arrive. Grace Miller carefully guided his wheelchair toward a seat near the windows where sunlight warmed the polished wooden floor. She adjusted the blanket across his knees and quietly wished him a peaceful afternoon before stepping away to assist another resident. Dr. Lauren Whitmore noticed the gesture immediately. "Grace," she called across the room, her voice carrying farther than she probably intended. "There is no reason to keep placing Mr. Hayes front and center. He has not participated in one of these gatherings in years." Several visitors looked toward them. Grace answered respectfully. "He enjoys looking outside, Doctor. The light seems to comfort him." Dr. Whitmore folded her arms. "Comfort is not the same as progress. We are here to encourage meaningful engagement, not imaginary breakthroughs." An awkward silence settled across the room. One of the administrative supervisors offered an uncomfortable smile before returning to greeting families at the entrance. Grace simply nodded and continued helping another resident adjust his hearing aids. A few minutes later, a volunteer invited everyone to share stories about loved ones who had served the country. Rebecca Hayes stood slowly, holding a faded family photograph of her father in his army dress uniform. Her voice trembled with both pride and sadness as she described the man who once remembered every birthday, every anniversary, and every bedtime story. He used to sing while fixing things around the house, she said with a gentle laugh. Sometimes he forgot the words, but somehow he always remembered the melody. She looked toward Walter, hoping for the smallest flicker of recognition. He continued staring toward the trees outside without any visible reaction. The room grew painfully quiet. Dr. Whitmore stepped closer to Rebecca and spoke with practiced kindness. Please remember that familiar stories are more meaningful for family than for patients at this stage. Expectations can sometimes make the healing process harder. Rebecca forced a polite smile, but disappointment settled across her face once again. Grace watched from the back of the room, her heart quietly aching for both father and daughter. As everyone prepared to move on to the next activity, Grace noticed something almost no one else did. Walter's eyes had shifted away from the window for only a moment. They rested on the old photograph in Rebecca's hands before drifting downward again. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. Did you see that? Grace whispered to the volunteer standing beside her. The woman looked confused. See what? Before Grace could answer her, Whitmore approached with a clipboard. Please stop searching for signs that are not there, she said quietly enough to avoid embarrassing Rebecca but firmly enough for nearby staff to hear. Families need honesty, not false hope. Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. Yes, doctor. She said nothing more. Yet as she gathered empty coffee cups after the event ended, one thought refused to leave her mind. Walter had not looked at the photograph by accident. Somewhere behind the silence, behind the years of fading memories and unanswered questions, something had recognized that picture before disappearing once again into the shadows. The following Monday began more quietly than usual. A light autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the courtyard outside room 214, and the early sunlight painted soft patterns across Walter Hayes's blanket. Grace Miller finished her morning rounds before returning with a fresh cup of coffee for herself and warm tea for Rebecca, who had decided to visit before work. Walter sat in his usual chair facing the window, his expression calm and distant, while the television remained muted in the corner. Rebecca opened another old photo album, turning each page slowly even though she expected no response. She had learned long ago that hope and heartbreak often arrive together. Grace stood beside the bookshelf searching for a collection of large print poetry that one of the residents had requested earlier. As she reached toward the top shelf, her fingers brushed against a small portable radio that had clearly not been used in years. Curious, she wiped away a thin layer of dust and turned the dial. Static crackled through the speaker before settling into a local station broadcasting a program honoring veterans from past generations. An elderly announcer spoke warmly about songs that had traveled across oceans with young servicemen and women, songs that reminded them of home during lonely nights far away from their families. Grace smiled faintly. Her father had loved programs like that. Before he passed away, he often sang old military tunes while repairing fences around their small house in Georgia. Never because he had served himself, but because his own father had taught them to him when Grace was a little girl. Without really thinking about it, she switched the radio off before it disturbed the residents. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she continued humming one of those familiar melodies while arranging fresh flowers on Walter's windowsill. It was soft enough that only someone standing nearby could have heard the words. Rebecca paused halfway through turning a page. My grandfather used to sing that, she whispered. Grace smiled politely. Mine too. I have not thought about it in years. The quiet melody drifted gently through the room, never louder than a conversation. It carried no urgency, no performance, only the simple warmth of an old memory passed from one generation to another. Then something impossible happened. Walter's fingers, which had rested motionless on the blanket all morning, tightened slowly around the fabric. His breathing changed almost imperceptibly. His eyes, usually fixed beyond the trees outside, blinked several times as though struggling to focus on something much farther away than the courtyard. Grace stopped humming immediately, worried she might have startled him. Rebecca leaned forward in silence. Walter slowly turned his head toward Grace. It was not the wandering glance they had seen countless times before. This movement was deliberate, careful, almost cautious, as though he were searching through decades of fading memories for a face hidden behind the music. Dr. Lauren Whitmore entered the room carrying Walter's updated chart, just as the silence settled over everyone. She noticed Grace standing beside the chair and frowned slightly. "Please avoid introducing unnecessary stimulation," she said in her usual professional tone. "Unexpected sounds can sometimes create confusion." Grace nodded apologetically. "I am sorry, doctor. I was only humming while I worked." Before anyone could speak again, Walter's lips moved ever so slightly. No sentence emerged. No clear word followed. Only one quiet breath escaped him, carrying the faintest whisper of a single name that sounded almost too soft to exist. "Nightingale." Rebecca's eyes widened. Grace froze where she stood. Dr. Whitmore looked up from the chart with visible confusion. The room fell completely silent because none of them had ever heard Walter Hayes say anything at all. Walter's whisper lingered in the room long after the sound itself had faded. Rebecca instinctively reached for her father's hand, her eyes filling with cautious hope, but she resisted the urge to speak. She had learned through years of disappointment that even the smallest interruption could cause fragile moments to disappear. Grace Miller remained perfectly still, her heartbeat suddenly louder than the quiet ticking clock on the wall. Dr. Lauren Whitmore looked from Walter to Grace before checking the medical chart again, almost as though the answer might already be written somewhere in the notes. "Did anyone else hear that?" Rebecca finally asked in a trembling voice. Grace nodded slowly. "He said one word." Dr. Whitmore maintained her professional composure. Single words occasionally surface in advanced dementia. They are often disconnected from present reality. Grace respectfully lowered her eyes, but something about Walter's expression felt different. His gaze was no longer drifting through the window. For the first time since she had met him, he seemed to be looking toward a real person instead of through one. Before anyone could speak again, a wheelchair rolled slowly past the open doorway. The resident sitting in it was Thomas Brooks, a retired Army chaplain in his early 90s who rarely joined conversations because severe hearing loss made communication difficult. One of the volunteers was guiding him toward physical therapy when Thomas unexpectedly lifted his hand. "Stop," he said with surprising firmness. The volunteer immediately slowed the wheelchair. Thomas turned his head toward room 214, his weathered face unusually tense. "Who said that word?" he asked. Grace stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Hayes whispered it just now." Thomas stared at Walter for several long seconds without blinking. His normally gentle expression slowly gave way to unmistakable astonishment. "That is not just a word," he murmured. "Not where I came from." Grace exchanged a confused glance with Rebecca. Dr. Whitmore walked into the hallway, her tone remaining measured. "Do you recognize it?" Thomas nodded almost absent-mindedly. "I heard that name once overseas many years ago. Not in a conversation. In a field hospital." He paused, searching through memories that had remained untouched for decades. Nobody knew who Nightingale really was. We were simply told that if someone used that name over the radio, wounded men suddenly had a chance to come home. The hallway grew noticeably quieter. Nurses passing with medication carts slowed their pace without realizing it. Even the volunteer pushing Thomas's wheelchair stood silently beside him. Dr. Whitmore folded her arms. "Military folklore has a way of growing larger over time," she said gently. Thomas looked directly at her. "Perhaps. But I buried enough friends to know the difference between stories and names people never forgot." He slowly turned back toward Walter's room. "The strange thing is that Mr. Hayes should never have remembered it. Almost nobody outside those operations ever heard that call sign." Rebecca felt a chill run down her arms. She looked at Grace with growing uncertainty. "My father never talked about classified assignments. Whenever I asked about the war, he always changed the subject." Grace quietly replayed the melody she had hummed only minutes earlier inside her own mind. It had been an ordinary family song as far as she had always believed. Yet somehow it had awakened a word that caused an old chaplain to stop in the middle of the hallway and remember events from another lifetime. Inside room 214, Walter Hayes slowly closed his eyes again, but this time a faint movement crossed his lips. It was not quite a smile. It was the peaceful expression of someone who had almost found the doorway to a memory that had been waiting, patiently and silently, for many years. By late afternoon the unusual moment had spread quietly through Willow Creek. No formal announcement had been made, Yet nearly everyone on the memory care floor had heard that Walter Hayes, a man who had gone months without speaking a recognizable word, had suddenly whispered a mysterious name after hearing a simple melody. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others were quietly curious. Grace Miller tried not to think about it as she completed her evening rounds. She reminded herself that her responsibility was to care for her patients, not to chase unanswered questions. Still, every time she passed room 214, she found herself wondering why that particular song had reached a place that years of therapy never had. The following morning, Rebecca arrived carrying a weathered cardboard box she had found while cleaning her father's attic. It contained neatly folded letters, faded photographs, military newsletters, and small keepsakes collected over a lifetime. "I thought maybe there is something here that could explain the name," she said as she placed the box on the small table beside the window. Grace carefully helped organize the contents while Walter quietly watched the sunlight move across the floor. Most of the papers described ordinary moments: holiday cards, newspaper clippings, retirement certificates. Then Rebecca unfolded an old photograph taken decades earlier. It showed a group of young soldiers smiling beside a temporary medical tent. Time had faded the colors until almost everything looked gray except for a handwritten sentence on the back. Rebecca slowly read the words aloud. To Walter. "Some songs are stronger than fear. Never forget that." From N. There was no last name, only the single letter. Grace felt a quiet chill. Before either woman could speak again, Walter's eyes settled on the photograph. His fingers slowly reached toward it with surprising purpose. They rested gently on the corner of the picture as though recognizing not the faces, but the memory attached to it. His breathing became slightly deeper. His lips moved again. This time no clear word emerged, only fragments carried by careful breaths. "Rain the hill. Keep singing." Grace and Rebecca exchanged astonished looks. Those were the longest words Walter had spoken in years. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Grace knelt beside Walter and spoke softly. "It is all right. Take your time." Walter blinked several times. His gaze remained fixed on the photograph while distant memories seemed to rise and disappear like waves. "Dark, cold. Then the song," he whispered. Across the room, Dr. Lauren Whitmore had quietly entered after receiving a message from one of the nurses. She observed Walter carefully without interrupting. Even she could no longer dismiss what she was witnessing as random speech. The fragmented memories followed a sequence rather than isolated words. They were connected by something deeper than chance. Rebecca carefully turned over another photograph from the same envelope. It showed a military choir entertaining service members during the holidays. On the bottom edge, nearly hidden by age, someone had written another brief note. "If you hear the old hymn, follow the voice." Grace stared at the sentence in complete silence. She had never seen either photograph before, yet every word seemed strangely connected to the melody her grandfather had taught her as a child. She had always believed it was simply an old family song passed through generations. Now she began to wonder whether it had traveled a much longer road before ever reaching her family. Walter slowly closed his eyes once more, but this time there was no empty expression on his face. Instead, there was the faint look of a man standing just outside a locked door, finally hearing someone on the other side reaching for the handle. The quiet discoveries of the past 2 days unsettled the entire staff in ways no one openly admitted. Nurses who had once hurried past room 214 now found reasons to glance inside. Therapists lingered a little longer outside the doorway. Even Dr. Lauren Whitmore reviewed Walter Hayes's medical history twice that morning, searching for any forgotten reference to the mysterious name or the handwritten notes Rebecca had discovered. There was nothing. His official military records contained commendations, overseas deployments, and an honorable retirement, but no mention of Nightingale, no reference to a special operation, and certainly no explanation for why an old melody had awakened memories buried beneath years of silence. Grace Miller continued her routine exactly as before. She adjusted Walter's blanket, checked his medications, and opened the curtains to let the morning sunshine warm the room. She deliberately avoided humming, unwilling to force another response that might never come naturally. Walter watched the birds outside with his usual calm expression, although every so often his eyes drifted toward Grace before returning to the window. Rebecca noticed the subtle change immediately. "He keeps looking for you," she whispered. Grace smiled politely. Perhaps he is only recognizing a familiar routine. Before Rebecca could answer, Dr. Whitmore entered carrying a small cognitive assessment kit. "I would like to conduct another evaluation," she said. "If yesterday represented a genuine neurological response, we need to document it carefully." Walter remained silent while the doctor gently asked familiar orientation questions. "Can you tell me your name?" No answer. "Do you know where you are?" Silence again. "Do you recognize your daughter?" Walter looked briefly toward Rebecca before lowering his eyes. Dr. Whitmore wrote several notes on her clipboard and quietly sighed. The remarkable progress from the previous day seemed to have disappeared. She closed the folder. "Unfortunately, this is more consistent with fluctuating dementia than meaningful recovery." Rebecca lowered her head, trying not to let disappointment show. Grace thanked the doctor for her evaluation, but something inside her refused to believe the story had ended. As everyone prepared to leave the room, Grace reached for the old photograph on the bedside table so she could return it safely to Rebecca's box. The motion was completely ordinary, yet as the picture passed in front of Walter, his eyes followed it immediately. His hand lifted from the blanket and gently touched Grace's wrist. The room became perfectly still. Walter looked directly into her face with a focus none of them had witnessed before. His voice remained fragile, but every word was unmistakably clear. "Do not stop singing." Rebecca covered her mouth in disbelief. Dr. Whitmore slowly lowered her clipboard without taking her eyes off Walter. Grace felt her heart race, yet she answered with the same calm kindness she always carried. "I will not." Walter's fingers relaxed, but he did not let go immediately. His gaze drifted beyond Grace, as though he were seeing another place layered over the hospital room. "We were lost," he whispered. "Rain everywhere. Nobody could see." Then she sang, "And we followed." His breathing remained steady, his expression peaceful rather than distressed. These were not disconnected words. They were fragments of a memory returning in sequence. Dr. Whitmore stepped closer, no longer speaking as a skeptic but as a physician witnessing something she could not easily explain. "Walter," she asked softly, "who sang?" Walter blinked once. His eyes slowly settled on Grace again. His lips parted with quiet certainty. "She did." The answer echoed through the room with astonishing simplicity. Every person present knew that Walter could not possibly be talking about Grace herself. Yet somehow, in the fading landscape of his memory, the quiet nurse standing beside him had become inseparably connected to the mysterious voice that had once guided frightened soldiers through one of the darkest nights of his life. The remarkable conversation with Walter Hayes spread far beyond the memory care wing before the day was over. By the following morning, administrators, physicians, therapists, and several veteran volunteers had quietly gathered outside room 214, careful not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere inside. Nobody announced a meeting. Nobody admitted they expected anything extraordinary. Yet each of them had come for the same reason. They wanted to see whether the impossible moment they had heard about would happen again. Grace Miller entered the room carrying Walter's breakfast exactly as she had every other morning. She greeted him with the same gentle smile, adjusted the curtains to let the early sunlight fill the room, and placed the tray beside his chair without changing a single part of her routine. She seemed completely unaware that nearly a dozen people were quietly observing through the partially open doorway. Rebecca stood near the window holding the faded photograph and the handwritten note they had discovered together. Dr. Lauren Whitmore remained beside the door with her clipboard, no longer searching for reasons to dismiss what had happened, but determined to understand it honestly. Grace poured Walter a small cup of tea before sitting beside him in comfortable silence. Several long moments passed. Nothing happened. A few observers exchanged uncertain glances. Then Rebecca looked toward Grace with quiet hope. "Would you sing it again?" she asked softly. Grace hesitated for only a second. "If it brings him peace," she answered. She began the familiar melody exactly as she remembered hearing it from her grandfather decades earlier. Her voice remained soft, warm, and completely unforced. It was not the performance of a trained singer. It sounded like someone sharing an old family memory with a friend. Halfway through the second verse, Walter slowly lifted his head. His breathing deepened. His eyes focused with remarkable clarity. He looked directly at Grace before quietly finishing the final line of the song, in a voice weakened by age but strengthened by unmistakable recognition. The room froze. Rebecca covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. One of the therapists quietly stepped backward in disbelief. Even Dr. Whitmore lowered her clipboard without writing a single word. Walter continued looking at Grace. "The bridge," he whispered. "You kept singing so we would know where to walk." He paused, drawing another slow breath. Nobody could see. "We followed the song." Before anyone could respond, a deep voice came from the hallway. I knew I recognized those words. Everyone turned toward the entrance. An elderly man in a neatly pressed navy blazer stepped through the doorway with measured confidence. His silver hair, military posture, and rows of service ribbons immediately drew every eye in the room. Rebecca recognized him first. "General Robert Callahan?" she asked in surprise. The retired four-star general smiled politely before looking at Walter. "We served during the same campaign," he explained quietly. Then his attention shifted toward Grace. "Young lady," he said with respectful curiosity, "where did you learn that song?" Grace answered honestly. "My grandfather sang it to me when I was a little girl. He said his older sister taught it to him after the war, but he never explained where she learned it." General Callahan's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened with unmistakable recognition. He removed his glasses slowly, studying Grace's face as though searching through memories more than half a century old. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet that everyone leaned closer to hear. "Tell me," he said gently, "what was your grandfather's family name before he was adopted?" Grace answered without hesitation. "It was Bennett." The general closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "Then I believe," he said softly, "we have finally found the family of the woman every soldier in our unit knew only as Nightingale." The room remained perfectly still after General Robert Callahan spoke those final words. Nobody reached for a clipboard. Nobody checked a monitor. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the quiet rustling of leaves beyond the window. Grace Miller stood speechless, trying to reconcile a lifetime of ordinary family memories with the astonishing possibility that someone in her own family had become a forgotten legend, known only by a single call sign. General Callahan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Grace. "Your grandfather's older sister volunteered as a civilian nurse during the war," he said gently. "Official records barely mentioned her because she insisted the soldiers deserved the recognition, not her. But when communication failed, when fear settled over exhausted young men, she would sing the same melody you sang today. They could not always see the medical station through the darkness or the weather, but they could hear her voice. They followed that song home." Tears filled Rebecca Hayes's eyes as she looked toward her father. Walter slowly turned toward Grace once more. The confusion that had clouded his face for so many years seemed to lift, if only for a precious moment. He smiled with quiet gratitude. "She told us," he whispered, his voice steadier than anyone had heard in years, "that if we kept walking toward hope we would never walk alone." Grace knelt beside him and gently held his hand. "Thank you for remembering," she said softly. Walter looked at her carefully, and then, for the first time since arriving at Willow Creek, he spoke a complete sentence without hesitation. "Thank you for bringing the song back." Rebecca quietly wept beside her father, overwhelmed by a gift she had almost stopped believing was possible. Dr. Lauren Whitmore lowered her head before walking toward Grace. The confident certainty she had carried for months had disappeared, replaced by genuine humility. "Grace," she said sincerely, "I believed I understood what healing looked like. I focused on charts, assessments, and measurable outcomes. You reminded all of us that compassion sometimes reaches places medicine cannot measure. I was wrong to dismiss your patience." Grace offered the same warm smile she had shown on her very first day. "We all wanted the same thing," she replied. "We just took different paths to reach it." General Callahan slowly raised his hand in a respectful salute toward Grace. Every veteran volunteer standing in the hallway instinctively followed him. One by one, aging men and women who had served their country stood a little straighter, offering silent respect not only to Grace but also to the forgotten nurse whose kindness had echoed across generations through a simple melody. No speeches were necessary. No medals were presented. The quiet dignity of that moment carried more meaning than any ceremony ever could. In the weeks that followed, Room 214 became known throughout Willow Creek as the room where hope had quietly returned. Walter never recovered every memory, and no miracle erased the challenges of dementia. Some mornings he still forgot names and dates. Yet whenever Grace entered the room and softly sang the old melody, Walter always looked up with peaceful recognition. He no longer remembered every face from his past, but he never again forgot the feeling of being guided home. A small framed copy of the faded photograph was placed on the wall beside his window, along with the handwritten words discovered on its back. Some songs are stronger than fear. Staff members who passed the room often paused for a moment before continuing their work, reminded that the greatest acts of service are not always recorded in official histories. Sometimes they survive only in quiet hearts, patient hands, and a song passed from one generation to the next until, at exactly the right moment, it finds the person who has been waiting to remember. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Your time, your support, and your kindness mean more than words can express. Every view, every thoughtful comment, and every moment you spend here helps keep stories like this alive. At The Hidden Nurse, we believe that the greatest heroes are not always the loudest or the most celebrated. Sometimes they are the quiet people who continue showing compassion when no one is watching, who choose kindness over recognition, and who change lives without ever asking for applause. That is the spirit we hope to bring into every story we share with you. Our channel is dedicated to unforgettable journeys filled with courage, humility, hidden strength, unexpected recognition, and the extraordinary impact that one caring person can have on the lives of others. Whether it is a quiet nurse, an overlooked caregiver, a forgotten veteran, or an ordinary person carrying an extraordinary past, every story reminds us that true character is revealed through compassion, integrity, and perseverance. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you that even the smallest act of kindness can leave a lasting mark on someone's life, we would truly appreciate your support. Please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe to The Hidden Nurse. By joining our growing community, you help us continue creating heartfelt stories that celebrate hope, resilience, and the quiet heroes who deserve to be remembered. Do not forget to turn on notifications so you will be among the first to discover each new story we share. We read your comments with great appreciation, and we always enjoy hearing where you are watching from and which moments connected with you the most. Your thoughts, your experiences, and your encouragement help make this community warmer and stronger with every new video. Until we meet again, may you always remember that kindness is never wasted, compassion is never forgotten, and even the quietest voice can become the one that guides someone home. Thank you once again for being part of the Hidden Nurse family. We look forward to sharing another unforgettable story with you very soon.